At 4:30 a.m. on October 2nd, 1940, the British Admiralty in London was looking at a statistical anomaly so terrifying it threatened to star the island nation into surrender. The war at sea was being won by the enemy's economy. German U-boats were not winning by sinking ships with torpedoes. They were winning by surfacing. A single torpedo was expensive and hard to reload. A U-boat captain preferred to use its cheap, high-caliber deck gun to sink slow, unarmed merchant vessels, preserving its valuable torpedoes for high-value military targets. The mathematics were simple. Deck gun, cheap, torpedo, expensive. The statistical casualty rate of British merchant shipping was unacceptable. Britain was losing tonnage faster than it could build it. The Navy needed to stop the U-boats from surfacing. They needed a trap that was so statistically perfect, the U-boat captain would feel compelled to surface, believing the target was zero risk. The official military solution was to send more dedicated warships for escort duty. But the Navy was stretched thin. A destroyer risked detection by German reconnaissance and wasted too much time protecting a single convoy. The escort had to blend in. The solution came from a forgotten tactic of World War I, the Q-ship. A warship disguised as a harmless civilian vessel, designed to lure the U-boat to the surface, drop its camouflage, and engage with overwhelming surprise. But for the Q-ship to work in 1940, the camouflage had to be absolute. The U-boat captains, disciplined, cold, and suspicious, had to be convinced they were facing an easy, civilian target. They had to choose a statistically cheap kill. The Admiralty needed the perfect disguise. They needed a ship that symbolized routine, peace, and utter harmlessness. They needed a vessel so mundane that a U-boat captain would deem it statistically impossible to be a threat. They chose the cross-channel ferry. The ferry was a passenger vessel designed for routine, predictable travel between England and France. It was white. It was slow. It carried civilian passengers, cars, and sometimes livestock. It was a statistical antithesis of a warship. It was a perfect lie. But running the deception required a man who knew the civilian maritime world perfectly. It required a master mariner, not a naval officer. The Admiralty selected Captain Edward Ted Smith. Smith was 55 years old, a retired civilian ferry master who had spent 30 years of his life navigating the English Channel. He wasn't a man of military doctrine. He was cynical, precise, and utterly dedicated to the maritime code. Smith hated the U-boats. He had lost his former chief engineer when a U-boat surfaced and sank his transport vessel in the North Sea. Smith saw the German tactic of sinking unarmed vessels not as warfare, but as mechanical murder. Smith was called to the Admiralty. He walked into the sterile London office in a civilian suit, carrying a worn chart. A senior admiral presented the plan. Take a requisitioned ferry, the HMS Fidelity, renamed for security, and convert it into a Q-ship. Captain Smith, the admiral stated, we need to hide 4 4-inch naval guns, depth charges, and a complete fighting crew inside a ship that looks like it is taking tourists to Calais. It must look harmless from a quarter-mile away, under a periscope, and through binoculars. Smith looked at the blueprints. The Navy engineers planned to hide the guns behind simple, rigid steel plating. That won't work, Admiral, Smith stated, instantly challenging military doctrine. The plates are too rigid. They will look like military modifications. A U-boat captain sees rigid steel. He stays down. We need canvas and wood. We need the ship to look old, slow, and soft. We need to preserve the illusion of fragility. The admiral was stunned by the defiance of the civilian. You are contradicting naval engineering doctrine, Captain. I am applying civilian logistics, sir, Smith replied. We need to preserve the illusion that this ship is low value and easy to sink. Smith took control of conversion. It became an illegal, unofficial conversion, driven by Smith's civilian genius over military doctrine. The transformation of the HMS Fidelity began in secret. The engineering challenge was immense. Hiding the heavy 4-inch guns behind thin, retractable screens that could instantly drop to reveal the guns. The mechanism had to be fast and absolutely silent. Smith designed a system of canvas screens and thin plywood panels. They were held up by simple pins, rigged to pull away instantly with a single lever, revealing the deck gun. The civilian captain was about to teach the Navy how to camouflage a 4-inch naval gun with a theatrical trick. The cost of failure was unacceptable. If the U-boat captain's surface realized the deception and managed to dive before the Q ship could fire, the entire mission would fail. The secrecy would be exposed, and every future Q ship would be doomed. Smith was risking his life, his honor, and the lives of his mostly civilian crew on a massive game of poker. The objective was clear: convince the enemy that they were making a statistically optimal choice right up until the moment of their destruction. The first challenge was not the enemy. It was the crew. Captain Smith, who insisted on being addressed by a civilian title master, refused naval personnel. He knew professional sailors, trained for combat maneuvers, would break the illusion. He needed men and women who could convincingly act as civilian tourists, not warriors. He recruited a crew of misfits, elderly retired dock workers, nervous young reserves, and even a few theatrical actors. Their primary skill was not gunnery, but performing a specific role under extreme stress. The transformation of the HMS Fidelity, ex-French passenger liner Lorraine, was meticulous, driven by Smith's obsession with civilian detail. He ordered the ship to be painted white, a color that screamed hospital ship or ferry. He left a few rusty patches on the hull, making the ship look old and poorly maintained, a low-priority target. Smith understood that the noise signature was as important as a visual. A warship hums with high-powered machinery. A ferry clanks and wheezes. Smith ordered the engine room to maintain a slow, inefficient rhythm, emitting the distinctive, lazy churning sound of a low-value passenger vessel. But the masterstroke was the panic party. Smith knew that if a German U-boat surfaced, its commander would observe the target for critical minutes before firing. He would look for the human reaction. The moment the alarm bell was sounded, the signal that a U-boat was sighted, half the crew would run to their hidden battle stations below deck, preparing the cannons. The other half, the panic party, would rush onto the main deck, acting out a scene of absolute disorganized terror. The panic party would throw inflatable toy life rings overboard. They would scream and frantically lower the wooden lifeboats, often jamming them for extra realism. They would run back and forth, visibly panicking for 5 agonizing minutes. The scene of total civilian panic was the bait. It confirmed to the U-boat captain, watching through his periscope, that this was not a professional military vessel. It confirmed the target was easy, defenseless, and ready to be sunk with the cheap deck gun. The risk was immense. During those 5 minutes of chaos, the U-boat, now fully surface and stable, had a perfect, unchallenged shot at the Q ship. In the late autumn of 1940, the HMS Fidelity, now looking every bit like the weary, low-value ferry it once was, began its patrol routes in the Bay of Biscay, a known hunting ground for U-boats. Day after day, the ship followed a predictable, seemingly aimless path, presenting itself as an easy target. The crew, the actors and the gunners, waited in suffocating silence. Weeks passed. Nothing. Smith's crew began to doubt. Was the illusion perfect enough? On November 2nd, the ship was making it slow, clanking progress through heavy fog. At 1400 hours, the lookout spotted a thin, metallic line cutting to the water 50 yards off the starboard bow. A periscope. The signal was given. The ship's main bell rang 3 times, the alarm. Captain Smith grabbed the microphone. Panic party to stations. Gunners, maintain absolute silence. Do not move a muscle. On deck, the panic party exploded into action. The crew members, wearing shabby civilian clothes, rushed to the lifeboats, deliberately fumbling the ropes. They screamed exaggerated insults at each other and pointed wildly at the direction of the periscope. The U-boat captain was watching a perfectly choreographed scene of maritime civilian collapse. The U-boat U-65, commanded by Lieutenant Wolfgang Geltner, a meticulous, suspicious officer, slowly surfaced. Geltner did not waste a torpedo. He aimed a cheaper, more efficient deck gun. Geltner watched the panic for 3 tense minutes, confirming his target was unarmed. The ferry's crew was abandoning ship in disarray. Statistically optimal target. Geltner gave the order, fire on the bridge. The U-65's deck gun barked once. The shell slammed into the ferry's superstructure, just below the bridge, sending splintered wood and canvas flying. The shell hit the exact spot where Smith had deliberately placed a non-essential laundry room, not the main powder magazine. The explosion was the U-boat's fatal mistake. It validated the ferry's fragility. Captain Smith was thrown to the deck by the blast. He grabbed the internal communicator. The gunners below deck were waiting in absolute silence, sweating, as the civilian actors continued their screaming performance just feet above them. The U-boat commander was satisfied. He was preparing to fire a second shell to finish the disabled civilian ship. Smith waited until the U-65 was completely exposed, stable on the surface, its crew busy reloading the deck gun. He counted. 5 seconds, 43. Now! Smith roared into the communicator. He slammed his fist down on the canvas-concealed lever. With a loud hydraulic clang and the tearing sound of canvas and plywood, the entire white facade on the HMS Fidelity's starboard side collapsed. The illusion vanished. In an instant, four massive oil 4-inch naval guns were revealed. Lieutenant Geltner, looking up at a supposed easy target, saw a wall of cold steel. The civilian ferry had become a warship. The shock was total. The U-boat was caught completely exposed, unmoving and out of its element. The game of poker was over. The trap had closed. The instant the HMS Fidelity shed its canvas skin, the statistical advantage of Lieutenant Geltner's U-65 vanished. Geltner had been betrayed by the most basic assumption of naval warfare, that a civilian ship is harmless. The German commander frantically gave the order to dive, but a surface U-boat is at its most vulnerable. The deck gun crew, who were still trying to reload after the first shot, were now exposed targets. Captain Smith's training and planning paid off. The converted ferry was slow, but its gunners were already at their stations, having spent 5 minutes silently listening to the frantic screams of the panic party above them. The element of surprise was absolute. The guns of Fidelity roared. First salvo, the 4-inch shells, fired almost point-blank, bracketed the U-boat. One shell screamed over the conning tower. The second slammed into the water, just a few feet from the hull, sending a massive geyser of water and shrapnel over the U-boat. Geltner screamed orders, trying to flood the ballast tanks and get below the surface. But the Q-ship's crew was faster. Second salvo, the gunners adjusted for the range. 2 shells struck the U-65. One hit the deck just forward the conning tower, tearing a massive hole in the pressure hull. The second shell hit the base of the conning tower, severing the external communications and jamming the diving planes. The U-boat was crippled. It could no longer dive. It was a stationary target on the surface. Captain Smith showed no mercy. This was not a fair fight. It was an execution of a predator caught in a snare. He ordered continuous, rapid fire. The panic party, the actors who minutes ago were screaming for their lives, were now below deck, calmly loading shells for the gunners. The surreal contrast between their roles was the key to their survival. The U-65, unable to dive or return fire effectively, began to lisp badly. German sailors, realizing the hopelessness of their situation, began climbing out of the hatch, ready to abandon the sinking vessel. Smith gave the order to deploy the depth charges, not to sink the U-boat, but to ensure its complete destruction. The Fidelity performed a tight, slow turn, a movement a passenger ferry would never make, and dropped 2 depth charges over the sinking sub. The resulting underwater explosion was deafening. It tore the U-65 in half. The oil slick began to bloom immediately on the surface, marking the grave of the U-boat and its crew. The entire engagement, from the moment of reveal to the sinking, had lasted just over 7 minutes. The Q-ship program had its first decisive victory. News of the sinking of U-65 was immediately classified as top secret. London knew the most critical part of the deception was not the killing of the U-boat, but the silence that followed. If the German Navy learned that the seemingly harmless cross-channel ferry was a Q-ship, the entire program would be compromised. They let the narrative stand that the U-65 was lost to a sudden, unexplained depth charge attack by a conventional destroyer. But the U-boat captains were meticulous in their reporting. Soon, reports began trickling back to the German command from other U-boats operating in the Bay of Biscay. Report 1 U-37 spotted a large, white civilian ferry, too low value to attack. Report 2 U-102 spotted a large, slow passenger ferry in the area where U-65 was lost. Did not engage. Report 3 U-128 reported an unusually aggressive civilian vessel that turned and began to steam directly towards a U-boat after surfacing. The U-boat immediately dived and withdrew. The U-boat commanders were starting to piece together the contradiction. Why was the civilian ferry acting with such unnatural confidence? The statistical profile of the target was changing. The fear was not just of the guns, but of the betrayal. The U-boat captains began to suspect that any vessel that seemed too easy, too slow, or too benign might be a trap. The very concept of surfacing for a cheap kill, the economic advantage of the U-boat, was now poisoned by doubt. Captain Smith and the HMS Fidelity had successfully altered the enemy's calculus of surfacing. The ferry, the symbol of low-risk logistics, had become a phantom of high-risk engagement. The simple trick of canvas and civilian clothes had accomplished what destroyers could not. It instilled paralyzing suspicion into the minds of the U-boat commanders. The psychological war had been won, but the Fidelity's career was far from over. The German Navy would soon begin actively hunting the white phantom that defied logic. The sinking of the U-65 was not an isolated event. It was a statistical trigger the Admiralty needed. News of the ambush, though never officially confirmed, spread among the U-boat captains through unwritten channels of paranoia and rumor. Over the next year, the psychological warfare achieved its strategic objective. U-boat surfacing attacks dropped dramatically. The U-boat commanders could no longer trust their visual assessment. Every slow-moving freighter became a potential trap. Every civilian ship became a statistical risk. The risk of surfacing and facing concealed 4-inch guns outweighed the economy of saving torpedoes. Admiral Karl Donitz, head of the German U-boat arm, was forced to issue new, desperate orders. U-boats were ordered to avoid surfacing to sink small merchant vessels and to rely almost entirely on costly torpedo attacks. The economic advantage, the key to Germany's success, was officially lost, killed by the phantom threat of the Q ship. The HMS Fidelity continued its patrols. Captain Smith and his civilian crew, the actors of the panic party, carried on their deadly performance. They knew their disguise had a short statistical shelf life. The enemy was now actively searching for the large, white, fast-sinking ferry. The cost of the deception was inevitable. On December 26, 1942, after 2 years of successful patrols, the Fidelity was spotted by a German Focke-Wulf 200 reconnaissance aircraft. The plane correctly identified the white ferry as an anomaly, a target too isolated and too aggressively positioned for a civilian vessel. The plane called in a strike. The Fidelity was hit by an acoustic torpedo, a weapon designed to track the sound of the ship's propellers. The ship, once a civilian liner, was now a legitimate military target. The HMS Fidelity was sunk. Captain Smith, the civilian master, died with his ship. The strategic success of the Q-ship program was complete, but the human cost was paid. The mission was immediately classified as top secret. Captain Edward Smith received no formal medal for the deception. His life's work was buried under layers of government secrecy. He could not be publicly credited with saving the Mediterranean supply lines, because that would reveal the trick, jeopardizing every future psychological operation. Smith was simply listed as a casualty of naval action. His legacy was erased to protect the lie he created. After the war, the Q-ship concept was dismissed by official historians. They credited the victory in the Battle of the Atlantic to the breaking of the Enigma code and the invention of better radar and sonar. They ignored the cheaper, more effective weapon, psychological deception. Captain Smith returned to civilian anonymity. His crew, the actors who performed the panic, were never recognized as soldiers. They were statistical footnotes in the war's final victory. But the truth lay in the numbers. The most devastating weapon against the U-boats was not a faster torpedo or a more powerful sonar. It was doubt, delivered by a slow, white ferry that looked exactly like a tourist ship. Smith was a civilian master mariner, who defied military doctrine and proved that the enemy's own statistical assumptions could be weaponized. He won the psychological war by convincing the U-boat captain that the statistically safe choice, surfacing, was, in fact, the most lethal. The system stole the credit, but the veterans kept the memory. The legacy of the Q-ship remains an unwritten testament to the power of the mundane object in the service of high-stakes deception. And now you know his name. If this story moved you, hit that like button. We are dedicated to finding the stories of people like Captain Smith, the civilians and outsiders whose ingenuity won the war, only to be erased by the bureaucracy they saved. Hit subscribe and join our community of history keepers. We ensure the truth of the psychological war survives. Drop a comment below. Tell us if you think Captain Smith should have received a posthumous George Cross for his deception. You are the final audience for the Civilian Master's secret. Thank you for making sure the Q-ship story is not lost to static.